The rain came down in sheets so thick, it turned streetlights into blurred halos, each drop hitting pavement with force enough to shatter against concrete. Dashwood stepped from his private club into the deluge, collar turned up against wind that carried the bite of autumn turning toward winter, his mind already calculating tomorrow's shipment routes and payment schedules. He'd built an empire on the principle that emotion was weakness waiting to be exploited. Tonight should have been no different from the 1,000 nights before it. Meetings concluded, money counted, problems eliminated with efficiency that left no room for second-guessing. His black sedan waited at the curb, engine purring, ready to return him to the mansion that overlooked the lake. But movement caught his eye near the iron gates, a small shape that didn't belong in this neighborhood where even shadows knew better than to linger without permission. The boy was pressed against the bars, as if trying to melt through them, his small hands gripping metal that probably burned with cold. Blonde hair was plastered dark against his skull, clothes soaked through until they clung like second skin, and he stood there trembling with determination that seemed impossible for someone so small. The neighborhood around Dashwood's estate was the kind where streetlights were maintained not by the city, but by private security firms, paid to ensure darkness never provided cover for unwanted activity. Every house stood at careful distance from its neighbors, separated by walls and hedges, and the kind of silence that money bought when it wanted to be left alone with its accumulation and power. Children didn't walk these streets after dark, not because rules explicitly forbade it, but because families who lived here understood that certain boundaries existed for reasons that didn't require explanation or discussion. The boy standing at the gates represented violation of unspoken codes, intrusion of desperation into world designed specifically to keep such things at comfortable distance, where they could be ignored or delegated to others. Dashwood's hand remained on the car door, rain streaming down the window between him and the small figure who waited with patience that suggested he'd stand there all night if necessary. Logic demanded he drive past, call someone to deal with whatever this situation was, maintain the separation between his world and whatever crisis had driven a child into storm at an hour when most people were home and safe. But the boy's eyes held something that cut through years of carefully constructed defenses, not manipulation or calculation, but pure, desperate hope mixed with terror that came from knowing this was last chance, final door to knock on before options ran out completely. Dashwood recognized that look from mirrors in his own past, from years before empire building had taught him how to hide vulnerability behind masks of power and control. The rain seemed to intensify as if nature itself was testing his resolve, drops hitting pavement hard enough to splash back up in patterns that looked almost violent in their intensity. Thunder rolled somewhere distant, promising the storm would get worse before it got better, warning anyone foolish enough to be outside that shelter was necessity rather than luxury tonight. He thought about the warm interior of his car, about the mansion waiting with its temperature-controlled rooms and expensive silence, about the life he'd built specifically to avoid moments exactly like this one. Dashwood felt his hand pause on the car door handle, instinct telling him to drive past. Children didn't approach these gates without parents who knew the risk, without understanding that the man who lived beyond them was not someone you disturbed. But the boy's face turned toward the approaching vehicle, and even through rain and darkness, those eyes found his. They were blue and desperate and holding something that looked dangerously close to hope mixed with terror that suggested he knew exactly whose gates he stood before. He stopped, watching through glass and water as the child's lips moved. No sound reached him over the storm's fury, but he found himself opening the door anyway, stepping into rain that immediately soaked through his suit. The boy didn't move closer, didn't run, just stood there with small hands clutched against his chest. He was protecting something from the downpour with determination that seemed too fierce for someone whose shoes were held together with tape, whose jacket hung 3 sizes too large. "What are you doing here?" The words came out harder than intended, sharp with the edge he used in rooms where weakness meant death. The child flinched but held his ground, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper against the roar of rain. "Sir, my sister didn't come home yesterday." Each word seemed to cost him something, pulled from depths of courage he shouldn't have needed to find yet. Dashwood felt something cold slide down his spine that had nothing to do with weather. He moved closer, noting details that painted a picture he didn't want to see. The hollow cheeks, the way the boy swayed slightly, as if standing took more strength than he had left. "Your sister." He repeated the words as if testing their weight, as if they might reveal themselves to be trick or trap designed by enemies who'd grown creative. The boy nodded, and his hand finally moved from his chest, revealing a photograph so soaked it had started to dissolve at the edges. A little girl smiled from the ruined picture, blonde like the boy, maybe a year or two older, gap-toothed grin captured in sunlight that felt impossible now. She went to get medicine for Mama. The child's voice cracked on the last word, and tears mixed with rain on cheeks that looked too drawn. She always comes back. She promised she'd always come back, but it's been a whole day and night and Mama's getting worse. Dashwood found himself crouching despite the puddle forming around his Italian leather shoes, bringing his face level with the boy's. Up close, he could see the child was shaking so hard his teeth chattered, could smell the mix of rain and fear and desperation. "What's your name?" The question came out softer than any words he'd spoken in years, surprising them both. "Merrick." The boy whispered it like a confession, like he understood that giving his name to someone like Dashwood might be dangerous. "My sister's name is Seraphine. She's 7, and she has hair like mine, and she was wearing her blue dress, the one Mama made from curtains." The detail about the curtains hit somewhere Dashwood thought he'd cauterized years ago, back when he still believed the world operated on anything resembling fairness. He stood abruptly, rain streaming down his face, trying to remember when he'd last looked at a child and seen anything other than liability. Dashwood made a decision that went against every rule he'd built his life upon, reaching down to lift Merrick into his arms. The boy weighed almost nothing, less than the bags of money he moved daily, and the small body trembled against his chest like bird caught in storm. "Come with me." He carried the child toward his car, feeling how the small hands gripped his coat with fingers that had gone white at the knuckles. His driver's eyes widened in the rearview mirror, but knew better than to ask questions about cargo that defied all logic. Inside the vehicle, heat blasted from vents, but Merrick continued to shake as if cold had settled into his bones permanently. Dashwood removed his own coat and wrapped it around the boy, watching as the expensive fabric swallowed the small frame completely, leaving only a pale face visible. "Tell me everything." He kept his voice level, controlled, the same tone he used when extracting information from people who thought they could lie. "When did your sister leave? What pharmacy? What time did she say she'd be back?" Merrick's words tumbled out between chattering teeth, painting a picture that grew darker with each detail. Seraphine had left yesterday afternoon when their mother's fever spiked, had taken the carefully counted coins they'd saved from the factory where Tegan worked double shifts when she could stand. The pharmacy was on Fletcher Street, miles away in a neighborhood where Dashwood's influence stretched like shadow. His sister had promised to be back before dark, had kissed Merrick's forehead, and told him to keep Mama cool with damp cloths while she was gone. But she never came back. Merrick's voice broke completely now, small hands clutching the photograph that continued to dissolve in his grip. "I waited, and Mama kept calling for her, and then Mama stopped talking at all and just burns hot like fire." Dashwood pulled his phone from his pocket, thumb moving across the screen with efficiency born from years of managing an empire that never slept. He sent 3 messages, short, coded, urgent, to people who owed him favors that could never be fully repaid. The medicine. He looked at Merrick directly, noting how the boy's eyes held intelligence beyond his years. "What was your mother sick with? What did Seraphine go to buy?" Merrick described symptoms that sounded like pneumonia, mentioned the pink pills the free clinic had given them last time, but wouldn't provide again without payment up front. He explained how Tegan had missed work because standing made her dizzy, how the landlord had threatened eviction, how everything had gotten bad so fast. The car moved through rain-slicked streets, while Dashwood's phone buzzed with responses. His network was vast, reaching into corners of the city that most people pretended didn't exist, and information flowed back faster than most police departments could manage. A girl matching Seraphine's description had been seen near the old warehouses in the industrial zone. Someone else reported a blue dress glimpsed between abandoned buildings where squatters sometimes sheltered, and worse things often happened after dark. Dashwood felt his jaw tighten, felt the familiar cold calculation sliding into place. The industrial zone was territory he'd cleaned out years ago, declared off-limits to his operations because the desperation there created complications he didn't need. "Stay here," he told Merrick as the car pulled to a stop in front of his mansion's gates. "My housekeeper will get you warm clothes, hot food, whatever you need. I'm going to find your sister." But Merrick's small hand shot out, gripping Dashwood's sleeve with surprising strength. "Please don't hurt her if she did something wrong. She was just trying to help Mama. She's a good person, the best person. She just gets scared sometimes." The plea revealed more than the boy probably intended. That Seraphine might have done something desperate to get medicine, might have stolen or bargained with currency that children should never have to consider. Dashwood felt something twist in his chest that he couldn't quite name. "I'm not going to hurt your sister." He said it clearly, holding Merrick's gaze until the boy nodded slowly. "But I need you to be brave a little longer. Can you do that?" Merrick nodded again, and Dashwood carried him into the mansion that stood silent and vast. His housekeeper appeared, shock crossing her weathered face before training took over, and she reached for the shivering child without asking questions that could wait. Dashwood watched Merrick disappear down the hallway wrapped in coat and care, then turned back to the rain. His driver was already pulling the car around, and weapons were checked with practiced efficiency that required no discussion or debate about what might be necessary. The industrial zone looked like a graveyard of ambition in the rain, warehouses standing empty with broken windows that resembled dead eyes. Dashwood moved through darkness with footsteps that made no sound, years of practice making him ghost in places where visibility meant vulnerability and hesitation meant death. His phone had given him a location, Warehouse 7, the one with the collapsed roof on the eastern side. 3 different sources had mentioned glimpsed movement there, a flash of blue fabric, sounds that might have been crying, or might have been wind through broken glass. The industrial zone had once been the heart of the city's manufacturing base, back when factories employed thousands and prosperity flowed from assembly lines that never stopped running. Now it was graveyard of American dreams, deferred and then abandoned, buildings standing empty like tombstones, marking where middle-class stability had died, slow death of outsourcing and automation, and corporate decisions made in boardrooms far from the lives they destroyed. Dashwood's empire had benefited from that decline in ways he rarely allowed himself to examine too closely. Desperate people made reliable employees willing to work for less. Abandoned property could be acquired cheaply for purposes that required discretion, and poverty created markets for services that thrived in shadows where law enforcement's reach grew thin and selective. He'd driven through this neighborhood countless times without really seeing it, viewing the decay as backdrop to business, rather than as testament to human cost of economic forces he'd learned to navigate and profit from. But tonight the darkness felt different, heavy with awareness that somewhere in these ruins, a 7-year-old girl was hiding because she'd tried to save her mother's life and been punished for the crime of poverty. His phone buzzed with another message. One of his informants had seen someone matching the pharmacist's description leaving the area an hour ago, walking quickly with the kind of agitation that suggested guilty conscience, or justified anger depending on perspective one brought to the situation. Either way, the man had given up chase, leaving Seraphine alone in darkness with whatever fear he'd planted during their encounter. The car's headlights cut through rain and shadow, illuminating abandoned loading docks and broken windows that reflected light back in fractured patterns that looked almost deliberate in their destruction. Dashwood found himself thinking about Merrick's small face as he'd described his sister, blonde like him, 7 years old, wearing a blue dress made from curtains because new clothes were luxury beyond their reach. How many times had he driven past children like Seraphine and Merrick without noticing them, without considering that each small face represented an entire world of struggle and hope and determination that existed parallel to his own experience? The question felt uncomfortable in a way that suggested answers might require changes he wasn't certain he was ready to make, transformations that would ripple beyond this single night of unexpected rescue into something larger and more complicated. He approached with hand near the weapon concealed beneath his jacket, aware that desperation turned people unpredictable. The warehouse door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and he slipped through the gap into darkness that smelled of mold and rain and something else, fear, fresh and sharp. Seraphine. He called the name softly, letting it echo through empty space. "Your brother Merrick sent me. He's safe and warm and waiting for you." Movement came from somewhere deep in the shadows, a scraping sound like small feet on concrete. Dashwood moved toward it carefully, letting his eyes adjust to darkness, broken only by streetlight filtering through holes in the roof. He found her behind a stack of rotting pallets, pressed into the corner as if trying to become invisible. The blue dress was torn and muddy, her blonde hair tangled with debris, and her eyes, those were the eyes of someone who'd seen things that would leave scars. "I'm not going to hurt you." He kept his voice level, non-threatening, the same tone he'd used with Merrick. "Your brother is worried. Your mother needs you. Let me help." Seraphine shook her head violently, tears streaming down cheeks that bore scratches from something or someone. Her hands were clutched around a small paper bag that she held to her chest like it contained something more precious than gold. "I got the medicine." Her voice came out hoarse, damaged from crying or screaming. "But the man at the pharmacy said it costs more now, And I didn't have enough, so I— She broke off, whole body shaking with sobs that seemed too large for her small frame. Dashwood moved closer slowly, hands visible, posture open. Whatever you did, whatever happened, none of that matters now. Merrick needs you. Can you walk? She tried to stand and crumpled immediately, pain crossing her face as weight hit her left ankle. Dashwood saw the swelling even in dim light, saw how her dress was torn at the shoulder in a way that made his hands curl into fists. Someone hurt you. It wasn't a question, and the cold fury that accompanied it was familiar, comfortable, something he knew how to channel into action that left no loose ends. Seraphine nodded, fresh tears falling. The man at the pharmacy got angry when I tried to take the medicine without paying. He grabbed me and I ran, but he chased me and I fell, and then I hid here because I didn't know where else to go. Dashwood removed his jacket, the second one tonight, and wrapped it around the shivering girl. Then he lifted her as carefully as he'd lifted her brother, feeling how she stiffened in fear, before exhaustion and relief made her collapse against his chest. The medicine, she whispered urgently, the bag still clutched in her hands. Mama needs it. Please, I know it's stealing, but she's so sick, and I didn't know what else to do. He looked at the crumpled paper bag, saw the name of a pharmacy he'd passed 1,000 times without thinking about who needed what behind those bright lights. You did what you had to do for your mother. That's not stealing. That's love. The words felt strange in his mouth, foreign after years of dealing in transactions where emotion was liability. But Seraphine's grip on the bag loosened slightly, and her breathing began to slow as warmth from his body seeped into her frozen limbs. He carried Seraphine toward the car, noting how she weighed barely more than her brother, how her breathing was shallow, and her skin was too cold. Rain continued to fall as he settled her into the back seat, and her eyes opened briefly to look at him with confusion and cautious hope. Where are we going? She whispered it like she was afraid of the answer, like she'd learned that adults who made promises were often the ones who broke them most completely. Home. Dashwood said it before thinking, then realized he meant the mansion, meant the place where her brother waited. We're going to get you warm, get that ankle looked at, and then we're going to help your mother. His phone buzzed with a message. Merrick had fallen asleep on the kitchen floor, refusing to go to bed until his sister returned. The housekeeper asked what she should do, and Dashwood found himself typing a response that would have seemed impossible 3 hours ago. He instructed Mrs. Fletcher to let the boy sleep wherever he felt comfortable, to keep watch over him without waking, to ensure that when Seraphine arrived home, her brother would be the first face she saw. But something fundamental had shifted in the hours since Merrick had appeared at his gates. Some calculation in his mind that had always measured worth in terms of profit and loss, now factoring in variables that couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets or quarterly reports. Seraphine stirred in the back seat as the car turned onto the private road that led to his estate. The mansion's lights blazed in the distance like beacon promising warmth and safety, though Dashwood wondered if such promises meant anything to a child who'd learned that bright lights often concealed darker intentions. His driver opened the car door without comment or question. Dashwood lifted Seraphine again, carrying her toward the entrance. Mrs. Fletcher met them at the door, concern etched into features that had witnessed many strange occurrences in her years of service, but perhaps none quite like this. She reached for Seraphine with practiced gentleness, but the girl's eyes opened at the transfer, and panic flooded in before recognition and exhaustion fought for dominance over fear. Let's get you warm and dry first, Mrs. Fletcher's voice carried the kind of no-nonsense gentleness that came from years of managing crises. Then we'll wake your brother so he can see you're really here, really safe. Merrick had indeed fallen asleep on the kitchen floor, curled into himself like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. But the moment Seraphine's voice broke through his exhaustion, just her name, whispered in recognition, his eyes snapped open, and he scrambled toward her with desperate relief. You came back. He sobbed it into her muddy dress, small arms wrapping around her waist despite the pain that made her wince. You came back like you promised, and I was so scared, and Mama needs you, and I didn't know what to do. Seraphine held her brother with one arm, while the other still clutched the paper bag of medicine. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered apologies into his hair, promises that everything would be okay now, reassurances that felt hollow, given the fever burning in their mother miles away. Dashwood watched the reunion with something uncomfortable moving through his chest, something that felt dangerously close to the emotion he'd spent years excising. His housekeeper approached with the kind of gentle efficiency that came from raising 3 daughters of her own, wrapping both children in blankets and guiding them toward the kitchen. Hot soup first, then we'll look at that ankle. Mrs. Fletcher had worked for Dashwood for 15 years and knew when not to ask questions. She moved with purpose, pulling ingredients from a refrigerator that could feed dozens, setting water to boil while the children watched with eyes that suggested they couldn't quite believe any of this was real. Dashwood stepped into his study and made another call, this one to his personal physician. Dr. Hammond owed him more than money could repay, a daughter's life saved from complications most hospitals would have bungled, and he answered on the second ring, despite the late hour. I need you at my house immediately. A child with a sprained or possibly broken ankle, hypothermia, possible assault injuries that need documenting. Dashwood kept his voice clinical, professional, pushing down the fury that wanted to surface when he thought about hands grabbing a 7-year-old girl. He gave the address where Tegan lay, fevered and unconscious, described symptoms that Hammond confirmed sounded like severe pneumonia requiring immediate intervention. I'll send an ambulance, the doctor started, but Dashwood cut him off with instructions that left no room for argument or protocol. No ambulance, no hospitals unless absolutely necessary. Handle it quietly. He knew how systems worked, how questions about a woman too sick to care for her children could lead to investigations, to children disappearing into foster care, to families torn apart by bureaucracy that claimed to help while destroying everything it touched. Back in the kitchen, Seraphine was explaining what happened at the pharmacy between sips of soup that Mrs. Fletcher kept refilling. The pharmacist had demanded payment up front, had refused to believe she'd bring money later, had reached for her arm when she'd grabbed the medicine and run. He called me a thief. Her voice was small, ashamed, and Merrick's hand found hers across the table. He said people like us are why honest businesses struggle, that we take and never give back anything except problems. Dashwood felt his jaw tighten at words that revealed more about the speaker than the children they were aimed at. He made a mental note of the pharmacy's name, filed it away in the part of his mind that never forgot debts owed or injustices requiring correction. You're not a thief, he said it clearly, pulling up a chair that felt too small for the weight of his presence. You're a daughter who tried to save her mother. There's nothing shameful in that. Seraphine looked at him with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young, eyes that had learned early how the world worked. But I didn't pay. I took something that wasn't mine. That's the definition, isn't it? The question hung in air, thick with the smell of soup and rain-soaked clothing. Dashwood found himself thinking about definitions, about how words like theft and justice changed meaning depending on who wielded them, and who suffered their consequences. Mrs. Fletcher returned with warm towels, wrapping one around Seraphine's shoulders with maternal efficiency that spoke of years spent caring for her own daughters through childhood illnesses and nighttime fears. The girl leaned into the warmth instinctively, small body finally beginning to stop its violent trembling as heat penetrated layers of cold that had settled into her bones during hours spent hiding in darkness. Dashwood watched the housekeeper work with practiced gentleness, noting how Seraphine's eyes tracked every movement as if cataloging potential threats even in this moment of apparent safety. Trust would take time. He understood that from years of dealing with people who'd learned that kindness often came with hidden costs, that offered hands sometimes closed into fists once you were close enough to grab. The photograph of Seraphine that Merrick had carried lay drying on the counter, colors bleeding into each other until the smiling girl in sunlight became abstract blur of blues and golds. But Merrick picked it up anyway, handling it with reverence that suggested the image mattered less than what it represented. Proof that happiness had existed once, evidence that better days might come again if they survived this night. I tried to remember what you taught me, Sarah. Merrick's voice was small but steady as he looked at his sister across the kitchen table. About being brave even when scared, about asking for help even when it's hard, about not giving up even when everything seems impossible and dark. The medicine is yours now. He stood, retrieving the crumpled paper bag from where Seraphine had finally set it down. Dr. Hammond is on his way to your apartment to treat your mother. He'll bring additional medication, everything she needs to recover fully. Merrick's soup spoon clattered against the bowl, eyes going wide. You're sending a doctor to Mama? A real doctor, not the clinic where they make you wait for hours and then tell you to drink water and rest. The hope in the boy's voice was almost painful in its intensity, and Dashwood nodded once. A real doctor who will make sure your mother gets well. But that ankle needs attention first. He gestured to Seraphine's swollen foot, noting how she'd been trying to hide the pain behind bites of bread and forced smiles. Dr. Hammond arrived within 20 minutes, medical bag in hand and questions kept behind professional discretion. He examined Seraphine with gentle efficiency, determining the ankle was badly sprained but not broken, wrapping it with care, while explaining how to manage pain and swelling. The scratches on her arms and shoulder need cleaning. Hammond's voice was neutral, but his eyes met Dashwood's with understanding that required no elaboration. I'll document everything, just in case records become necessary later. Hammond left for Tegan's apartment with instructions and medication that would have cost more than she earned in 6 months. Dashwood found himself pacing his study, phone in hand, waiting for updates that came in measured intervals. Patient found unconscious, fever dangerously high, lungs compromised but responding to initial treatment. The children had fallen asleep on the leather sofa in his library, Seraphine's bandaged ankle elevated on pillows, while Merrick curled against her side. Mrs. Fletcher had covered them with quilts that usually decorated guest rooms no one ever used, and she'd positioned herself in a nearby chair like a guardian against nightmares that might dare approach. They haven't asked for food or toys or anything except news about their mother. She spoke softly when Dashwood entered, her expression holding something between sympathy and reproach. That little girl apologized for bleeding on your carpet. 6 years old, and she's apologizing for getting hurt. Dashwood looked at the spot where Seraphine's muddy shoes had left marks on Persian rugs worth more than most people's cars. The stains seemed insignificant compared to the 2 small figures who'd brought chaos into his carefully controlled world, who'd disrupted order with their desperate need and fierce loyalty. His phone buzzed with another update. Tegan's fever was breaking under aggressive treatment, but she remained unconscious. Hammond estimated she'd been sick for at least a week, pushing through symptoms that would have hospitalized most people, working double shifts while her lungs slowly filled with fluid that could have killed her. She'll need hospitalization. Hammond's message continued with details about oxygen saturation and antibiotic regimens, but she's stable enough to transport. I'm bringing her to your location unless you object. She shouldn't be alone in that apartment, and the children will want to see her. Dashwood typed his agreement, then stood looking out windows that framed the lake in darkness. Rain had finally stopped, leaving everything clean and cold and somehow more real than before. He was making decisions that defied every principle he'd built his empire upon, inviting strangers into his home, exposing himself to complications that couldn't be controlled or predicted. Mrs. Fletcher cleared her throat gently. I've prepared the guest suite on the 2nd floor. Fresh linens, the room that gets morning sun. I thought the mother might want to be near her children when she wakes. The presumption should have irritated him. Staff didn't make decisions about who stayed in his house. But Dashwood found himself nodding, accepting the arrangement that transformed his mansion from fortress into something dangerously close to shelter. Hammond arrived 30 minutes later with Tegan unconscious on a stretcher, an IV line running into her arm and oxygen mask covering her face. She was younger than Dashwood expected, couldn't be more than 27, with features that would be pretty without the pallor of illness, and the dark circles that spoke of exhaustion beyond physical sickness. They moved her carefully to the prepared room while the children slept on, unaware that their mother now rested 20 feet away. Hammond set up monitors that beeped softly, adjusted medication drips with practiced efficiency, and finally stepped back to survey his work with satisfaction. The guest suite had been transformed into something resembling a private hospital room, equipment arranged with precision that spoke of Hammond's decades of experience, treating patients whose circumstances required discretion as much as skill. Oxygen tanks stood ready beside the bed. IV poles gleamed under soft lighting, and medication lined the bedside table in rows that represented healing measured in milliliters and minutes. Dashwood stood in the doorway watching Tegan's chest rise and fall, with rhythm that was finally steady, finally strong enough to suggest survival, rather than just continued existence. Her face in sleep looked younger than he'd expected, features relaxed from whatever tension had been holding them tight, even in unconsciousness. Dark hair spread across white pillows like ink on snow. He found himself wondering what she'd been like before circumstances ground her down to survival mode, whether she'd had dreams beyond making rent and keeping her children fed, whether she'd laughed easily, or if that ability had been sacrificed somewhere along the path from whatever past she'd had to this present that nearly killed her. The questions felt intrusive, even unspoken, but they persisted anyway. Hammond appeared beside him, medical bag packed and coat already on for the drive home through streets that had finally stopped producing rain. She's a fighter, that one. Most people would have sought help days ago, but she pushed through because stopping meant her children went hungry or cold or worse. That kind of determination is admirable and absolutely reckless in equal measure. She'll sleep for several hours at minimum. The doctor packed his equipment with methodical precision. The fever should continue dropping, and her lungs will clear gradually. She was maybe 48 hours from critical, possibly less. Those children saved her life by finding you. The words settled heavily in air that smelled of antiseptic and clean sheets. Dashwood thought about Merrick standing in rain at his gates, about Seraphine stealing medicine she couldn't afford, about desperation that drove children to knock on doors that should have remained closed. When she wakes, she'll be confused, and probably frightened, Hammond continued, studying Dashwood with the directness of someone who'd earned the right to speak plainly. She'll wonder why a man like you helped, what you want in return, whether her children are safe or in debt they can't repay. Dashwood had no answer that made sense even to himself, no explanation for why he'd carried a soaking boy into his car, or why he'd driven through rain to find a girl he'd never met. He'd built an empire on transactional relationships, where everything had price and payment, where favors were currency and debts were leverage. Tell her the truth when she asks, he finally said, though he wasn't sure what truth meant anymore. Her children needed help. I provided it. There's no debt, no payment required, no strings attached to recovery or safety. Hammond's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded and continued packing. I'll return tomorrow morning to check on everyone. Call immediately if her condition changes, or if the children need anything. And Dashwood, he paused at the door, expression serious. Whatever you're doing here, it's good. Don't overthink it. After the doctor left, Dashwood returned to his study where paperwork waited and business required attention. But he found himself unable to focus on shipping schedules or payment collections, his mind returning repeatedly to the second floor where strangers slept in rooms that had been empty for years. Mrs. Fletcher appeared with tea he hadn't requested, setting the cup on his desk with the kind of gentle insistence that couldn't be refused. Those children have been through something terrible. Not just tonight, but for a long time before this. You can see it in how they move, how they apologize for existing. Dashwood wrapped his hands around the cup's warmth, letting steam rise into air that felt too cold, despite the fire burning in the hearth. What am I supposed to do with them? I don't know anything about children or families or what happens next. You do what they need. Mrs. Fletcher spoke with the certainty of someone who'd raised her own through hardship. You keep them safe. Keep them together. Give them time to remember what it feels like to not be afraid every moment. The rest figures itself out. Dawn came gray and uncertain, light creeping through windows with the hesitation of something unsure of its welcome. Dashwood had dozed in his study chair rather than going to his bedroom, some part of him needing to stay close to the chaos that had invaded his carefully ordered world. The sound of small feet on marble floors brought him fully awake, and he found Merrick standing in the doorway with blanket wrapped around his shoulders like cape. The boy's eyes were wide and worried, hair sticking up in directions that suggested restless sleep. Is Mama here? The question came out barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile reality they'd stumbled into. Seraphine said I dreamed it, but I thought I heard voices in a car and I just need to know if Mama is okay. Dashwood stood, muscles protesting from a night spent in a position meant for working rather than sleeping. Your mother is upstairs, in a bedroom near where you slept. The doctor brought her here last night, and she's getting the treatment she needs. Merrick's face transformed, hope and relief, and something close to disbelief warring across features too young to hide emotion effectively. Can I see her? Please? I promise I'll be quiet and I won't wake her up. I just need to see that she's really here and really breathing. The desperation in the plea revealed layers of fear that had nothing to do with one night of separation. This was a child who'd learned that people you loved could disappear without warning, that breathing wasn't guaranteed, that tomorrow might bring loss too large to survive. Come with me. Dashwood led the way upstairs, aware of Merrick following close enough that the blanket occasionally brushed against his legs. The guest suite door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap came the soft beeping of monitors that measured heartbeat and oxygen in steady rhythm. Tegan lay motionless under white sheets, IV lines running into her arm, an oxygen mask still covering her face. But her chest rose and fell with regularity that hadn't existed hours before, and color had started returning to skin that had been gray with illness and exhaustion. Merrick approached the bed with steps so careful they made no sound, small hand reaching out to touch his mother's arm, as if confirming she was solid and real. Mama, he whispered it like prayer, like incantation against fear that had lived in his bones. Mama, I found help. Seraphine is safe and you're getting medicine and everything's going to be okay now. Dashwood watched from the doorway, noting how the boy climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed, curling against his mother's side with practiced ease that suggested he'd done this many times before. comfort given to someone too sick to provide it herself, warmth shared when heating bills went unpaid, presence offered when words failed. Seraphine appeared behind him, limping slightly despite the bandaged ankle, Mrs. Fletcher supporting her elbow with gentle firmness. The girl's eyes found her mother immediately, and tears started falling before she'd taken 3 steps into the room. "I got the medicine, Mama." She spoke to the unconscious woman with voice thick with emotion. "I know you told me not to go that far alone, but you were so sick, and I didn't know what else to do. And I'm sorry I scared Merrick, but I had to try." The apology contained multitudes. Sorry for being gone. Sorry for being caught. Sorry for needing rescue. Sorry for existing in a way that created problems and complications. Dashwood felt something cold settle in his chest at hearing a child apologize for trying to save a parent's life. "She can't hear you yet." Mrs. Fletcher's voice was gentle, guiding Seraphine to sit in the chair beside the bed. "But the doctor said she's going to be fine. Her fever is almost gone and her breathing is stronger. You did exactly the right thing getting help." Merrick looked up from where he'd pressed himself against his mother's side, blue eyes finding Dashwood with intensity that seemed too fierce for someone so small. "Thank you for bringing her here. Thank you for finding Seraphine. Thank you for not turning me away when I knocked on your gates even though I know you're supposed to be scary." The honesty was startling. Acknowledgement that the boy had known exactly whose door he was knocking on and had done it anyway. Desperation trumped fear. Love stronger than self-preservation. Family worth any risk, including those that might destroy you. "You were brave," Dashwood heard himself say it, surprised by the truth in words he rarely spoke. "Both of you were braver than most grown men I know. Your mother is lucky to have children who fight for her the way you do." Seraphine's hand found her brother's across their mother's sleeping form, fingers intertwining with familiarity born from being each other's primary comfort for years. "Will she really be okay?" The doctors at the free clinic said pneumonia can be dangerous, that people die from it if it gets bad enough. "She'll recover fully." Dashwood spoke with certainty that came from Hammond's assurances and resources that made full recovery possible. "It will take time, but she'll get stronger every day. You won't lose her." The promise hung in air thick with antiseptic and hope, and Dashwood wondered when he'd started making promises he couldn't guarantee. But watching the tension drain from both children's small bodies, seeing how they exhaled fear they'd been holding for days or weeks or maybe longer, he couldn't bring himself to add caveats or conditions. Mrs. Fletcher set breakfast on the small table near the windows, eggs and toast and fruit arranged with care that suggested she understood how presentation mattered when everything else felt uncertain. "You should eat something, both of you. Your mother would want you to take care of yourselves while she can't." Merrick hesitated, clearly torn between hunger and the need to stay close to Tegan. But Seraphine nudged him gently, and they moved to the table with backward glances that checked their mother remained solid and breathing and present. Dashwood left them there under Mrs. Fletcher's watchful care, returning to his study where reality waited in the form of phone calls requiring attention and decisions demanding to be made. But business felt distant somehow, less urgent than it had 48 hours ago, as if priorities had shifted without his permission or understanding. His phone showed messages from associates who'd helped locate Seraphine, asking if further action was required regarding the pharmacy or the pharmacist who'd grabbed a child. Dashwood stared at the screen, considering responses that ranged from professional consequences to personal visits that left lasting impressions. But revenge felt hollow, compared to the sound of children eating breakfast without fear, compared to a mother breathing steadily in a clean bed with medicine flowing through her veins. Maybe that was victory enough, not destruction of those who'd caused harm, but protection of those who'd survived it. He deleted the messages without responding, choosing inaction that felt more powerful than the violence his associates expected. The pharmacist would continue his petty tyranny over desperate people, would grab other children who couldn't afford medicine their parents needed, would sleep soundly believing himself righteous in his small-minded enforcement of rules that punished poverty like crime. But Seraphine was safe now, eating breakfast with her brother in a house where money wasn't counted in coins carefully saved, where medicine appeared when needed without negotiation or humiliation. That mattered more than teaching lessons to men who'd never learned them anyway, more than satisfying the part of himself that still believed in consequences delivered with precision, that left no room for second chances. The sound of laughter drifted from upstairs, genuine, unguarded, the kind children made when they forgot to be afraid for a moment. Dashwood recognized it as foreign to his mansion as spring flowers in winter, as warmth in rooms built to intimidate rather than welcome, as proof that walls designed to keep danger out had also kept life from entering. His empire had been constructed on foundation of fear and respect that were often indistinguishable from each other, on transactions where everyone understood their role and stayed within boundaries drawn by power and consequence. But these children and their mother existed outside those rules, operating according to logic that prioritized love over safety and connection over survival instinct. Tegan woke on the second day, confusion flooding her fever-bright eyes as consciousness returned in fragments that didn't make sense together. Her hand moved immediately to the IV line in her arm, then to the oxygen mask on her face, panic rising in features that had known too many moments when things went wrong without explanation. "Mama," Merrick's voice broke through her disorientation, and he was there beside the bed before she could try to sit up. "Mama, you're okay. You're safe. We're all safe." Seraphine appeared on the other side, limping slightly, taking her mother's free hand with gentle pressure. "The doctor says you had pneumonia really bad. You've been sleeping for almost 2 days while the medicine works." Tegan's eyes moved between her children with the kind of assessment that mothers perfect through necessity, checking for injuries, for fear, for signs of harm that might not show on surfaces. Her gaze landed on Seraphine's bandaged ankle, and something dark crossed her face before confusion returned stronger. "Where are we?" Her voice came out hoarse, damaged from days of fever and shallow breathing. "This isn't the apartment. This isn't the hospital. Where?" She tried to push herself up, despite tubes and wires connecting her to machines that beeped protests. Dashwood had been standing near the windows, giving the family space for reunion. But he stepped forward now. "You're in my home. Your children came to me for help, and I provided it. You've been receiving treatment here from my personal physician." Tegan's eyes found him, and widened with recognition that came from somewhere deeper than personal acquaintance. She knew who he was, not by name necessarily, but by reputation that preceded him in neighborhoods where power was felt before it was seen or understood. "Your children?" She looked back at Merrick and Seraphine with fear that hadn't been there before. "What did you do? Where did you go? Oh God, what have you gotten us into?" The panic in her voice cut through the room like blade, sharp enough that both children flinched. Merrick's small hand tightened on the sheets, while Seraphine's face crumpled with guilt that suggested she'd anticipated this exact reaction. "I went to get medicine, and the pharmacist grabbed me, and I ran and got lost." Seraphine's words tumbled out fast, desperate to explain before judgment fell. "Merrick went to find help because you were so sick and I wasn't coming back and he didn't know what else to do. He found me." Dashwood kept his voice neutral, professional, trying to defuse fear that was entirely rational given what she likely knew about him. "He asked for help finding his sister. I found her. I brought you here when my doctor confirmed you needed immediate treatment." Tegan's breathing accelerated, making the monitors beep more urgently. "We can't pay for this. We can't. I don't have anything you could want. Nothing worth the debt we'd owe for treatment like this." The words revealed exactly what she expected, what experience had taught her about men with power who offered help to women with nothing. Dashwood felt disgust rise, not at her assumption, but at the world that had made such assumptions necessary for survival. "There is no debt," he said it clearly, holding her gaze despite how she tried to look away. "Your children needed help. You needed help. I provided it. That's where the transaction ends. Nothing is free." Tegan's voice shook with certainty born from hard lessons. "Men like you don't help women like me without expecting something in return. I know how this works. I know what usually comes next." Merrick's small voice broke the tension that had pulled tight enough to snap. "He's been nice, Mama. He gave us soup and warm beds, and he sent the doctor to you, and he didn't ask for anything except to help us. He found me in the warehouse when I was so scared," Seraphine added, tears streaming down her face. "He carried me to the car and told me I wasn't a thief, and he didn't hurt me even though I stole medicine." Tegan looked between her children and the man who'd become their unlikely savior, conflict playing across features that were still too pale. She tried to sit up again, managed it this time despite how the movement made her wince with pain that spoke of ribs damaged from days of coughing. "I need to leave." She reached for the IV line with hands that trembled. "We need to go home. We can't stay here. We can't owe someone like you anything because the price will eventually come and we won't be able to pay it. Mama, please." Merrick's voice cracked with desperation that echoed how he'd sounded standing in rain at the gates. "You're still sick. The doctor says you need more medicine and rest, and you can't walk yet without help." Dashwood moved to the chair beside the bed, sitting slowly so his sighs wouldn't feel threatening. Listen to me carefully. I understand your fear. I understand why you assume I want something, but I'm asking you to stay until you're well enough to make decisions that aren't driven by panic. Tegan's hands stilled on the IV line, but suspicion remained etched into every line of her body. Why would you do that? Why would someone like you care what happens to people like us? The question hung heavy with implications about class and power, and the distances that separated worlds occupying the same city. Dashwood found himself without an answer that would satisfy her skepticism, because he didn't fully understand it himself. Maybe I'm tired of living in a house with too many empty rooms. The words came out before he could stop them, honest in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. Maybe your son standing in the rain reminded me that there are things more important than the empire I've built. Tegan studied him with eyes that had learned to read people for survival, looking for the lie or manipulation that surely hid beneath surface sincerity. And when I'm well? When we're no longer interesting or useful, what happens then? Then you decide what comes next. Dashwood held her gaze steadily. You stay if you want. You leave if you want. You make whatever choice feels right for you and your children without debt or obligation. I'm offering time and safety, nothing more and nothing less. The silence stretched long enough that the monitor's beeping became the only sound, measuring heartbeats that gradually slowed from panic toward something closer to cautious consideration. Tegan looked at her children, at Merrick's hopeful face and Seraphine's fearful one, and something in her expression shifted. 1 week, she finally said, voice rough with exhaustion and resignation. 1 week for me to get strong enough to leave properly, to figure out what happens next. But I work for anything we use, food, space, whatever. I don't accept charity. Dashwood nodded once, accepting terms that gave her dignity, even if they made no practical sense. Mrs. Fletcher can always use help in the kitchen, and the library could use organizing. It's been neglected for years. Relief and suspicion warred across Tegan's face in equal measure, and she settled back against pillows that probably cost more than a month's rent in the apartment she'd nearly died in. Her hands smoothed the blanket with nervous energy that needed outlet, fingers tracing patterns in fabric that felt impossibly soft compared to the threadbare sheets she was accustomed to sleeping on. I don't understand you. She said it quietly, almost to herself, but loud enough that Dashwood heard the confusion beneath the words. Men with your reputation don't rescue sick women and their children. They don't offer rooms in their homes and doctors in the middle of the night. They don't negotiate with people who have nothing to offer in return except gratitude that won't pay any bills or settle any scores. Merrick shifted on the bed beside his mother, small hand finding hers with the automatic comfort of someone who'd spent years being her anchor when everything else felt uncertain. Maybe he's different than his reputation, Mama. Maybe people tell stories that aren't true, because being scared of someone is easier than knowing them for real. The wisdom in the 6-year-old's words landed heavily in the space between adult understanding and childish faith. Dashwood met Tegan's eyes over her son's head, and saw the moment when she decided to stop fighting quite so hard, when exhaustion and hope combined into something fragile that might grow stronger with time and proof. And my children stay with me. Tegan's voice gained strength, maternal protectiveness overriding physical weakness. They sleep in my room. They eat with me. They're never alone with anyone I don't know and trust. Of course. The agreement came easily, because he'd expected nothing less from a mother who'd taught her children to be fierce and loyal, and willing to walk through storms for each other. Your family stays together. That's not negotiable. The week Tegan had demanded stretched into 2 as her body slowly remembered what it felt like to breathe without pain. Dashwood found his routines disrupted in ways both irritating and oddly compelling. Breakfast was no longer solitary, but filled with Merrick's chatter about books he'd discovered in the library. Afternoons included Seraphine's drawings appearing on his desk as gifts he didn't know how to refuse. Tegan kept her word about working, organizing the library with methodical precision that revealed an education interrupted by necessity rather than lack of capability. She moved through the mansion with quiet dignity, accepting help only when physical limitation made pride impossible, speaking to staff with courtesy that came naturally rather than from servitude. Mrs. Fletcher had become something between grandmother and guardian to the children, teaching Merrick to bake bread and showing Seraphine how to mend the tears in her blue dress. The house felt different, with voices echoing through halls that had known only silence, with laughter occasionally breaking through the careful control Dashwood maintained over his domain. He found himself returning home earlier than business required, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Dinner had become a shared meal around the kitchen table, rather than a solitary plate in his study, and he discovered that Merrick had opinions about everything, while Seraphine observed the world with artist's eyes that caught details others missed. "Why don't you have pictures on the walls?" Merrick asked one evening between bites of chicken that Mrs. Fletcher had prepared with herbs from the garden. Rich people always have pictures in movies, paintings of old guys with beards and horses and stuff. Dashwood looked at the bare walls he'd never questioned, chosen because art felt like pretension, and family portraits seemed cruel when family didn't exist. "I never saw the point. They're just things taking up space, but they tell stories." Seraphine's quiet voice carried conviction, despite her usual shyness. "Even if you don't know the people, you know someone cared enough to paint them, to remember them. That matters." The observation settled uncomfortably in his chest, suggesting that emptiness was choice rather than necessity. Tegan met his eyes across the table with expression he couldn't quite read, something between sympathy and challenge, as if daring him to examine what he'd built and why. Days acquired rhythm that felt foreign in its domesticity. Mornings brought coffee while Merrick did schoolwork that Tegan supervised with determination that her children wouldn't fall behind. Afternoons found Seraphine drawing on the terrace when weather allowed, capturing the lake in charcoal strokes that suggested talent worth nurturing. Dashwood discovered himself involved in conversations that had nothing to do with business or power, debates about whether chocolate or vanilla was superior, discussions about books where Merrick took plots personally, quiet exchanges with Tegan about how to help Seraphine trust that safety might last beyond the moment. "She wakes up every night checking that I'm still breathing," Tegan told him one evening after the children had gone to bed. "She has nightmares about the warehouse, about the pharmacist grabbing her, about getting lost and never finding her way back home." Dashwood set down the book he'd been pretending to read, attention shifting fully to the woman who'd become something more complicated than guest or charity case in the months since her children had disrupted his carefully controlled existence. "Has she talked about what happened? Beyond the basics she told us that first night?" Tegan's hands stilled on the spine of the volume she was shelving, shoulders tensing in a way that suggested the answer carried weight she didn't want to set down. Pieces, fragments that come out when she's half asleep, or drawing something that starts as flowers and becomes darkness. The pharmacist didn't just grab her arm. He called her trash, told her that people like her mother breed children they can't feed and expect honest workers to subsidize their poor decisions. The words settled into Dashwood's chest like stones, cold and heavy, and sharp enough to cut if handled carelessly. He'd heard similar sentiments from business associates who complained about taxes funding social programs, from wealthy neighbors who resented seeing poverty intrude on their carefully maintained neighborhoods, from people who'd never known what it meant to choose between medicine and food. She believed him. Tegan's voice cracked slightly. "That's what breaks my heart. She came home thinking she'd done something shameful by trying to save my life, that we were the problem for existing in a way that required help. 7 years old and already learning to apologize for needing things she can't provide for herself." They were sitting in the library where Tegan had been organizing books by subject, rather than the random system that had existed before. Rain tapped against windows with rhythm that felt less ominous than the storm that had brought Merrick to his gates weeks ago. "Merrick has them too," she continued, hands still moving to shelve volumes with careful precision. "He dreams that he's knocking on doors and no one answers, that he's standing in rain forever while his sister disappears and I die and he's alone with no one who cares." Dashwood felt something twist beneath his ribs at the image of a 6-year-old carrying that kind of fear. But someone did answer. He found help. The nightmares are just echoes of what didn't happen. Are they? Tegan turned to face him fully, exhaustion and worry evident despite weeks of recovery. "We're still here on borrowed time, in borrowed space, waiting for the moment you realize we're more trouble than we're worth. The nightmares know what we're trying to forget." The accusation wasn't harsh, just honest acknowledgement of impermanence that defined their situation. They existed in limbo, neither guests nor residents, occupying space without claim to it beyond his willingness to allow their presence. "What if you stayed?" The words surprised him, as much as they seemed to surprise her. Not temporarily, not as guests working off imaginary debt. Just stayed. Tegan's laugh came out sharp and disbelieving. "Stayed? Here? Us? You can't be serious. Men like you don't just invite families like ours to live in mansions because a little boy knocked on your door one rainy night. Why not?" Dashwood found himself standing, moving to the windows that framed darkness and lake in equal measure. "This house has 16 bedrooms, and most of them have never been slept in. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. What's the point of any of it if it's just me rattling around in silence? The point is, it's yours." Tegan's voice carried weight of someone who'd never owned anything outright, who understood possession as temporary and conditional. You earned it or took it or built it, but it's yours. We don't belong in your world any more than you belong in ours. Dashwood turned to face her, noting how she'd regained weight and color, but still carried shadows under her eyes that spoke of years of struggle. Maybe I'm tired of my world. Maybe your son did more than ask for help. Maybe he asked questions I'd stopped letting myself consider. Like what? The challenge in her voice suggested she expected platitudes about loneliness or meaning, empty words that wealthy people use to justify whatever they wanted. Like, what's the point of power if it doesn't protect anyone worth protecting? He moved closer, hands in pockets to keep them from gesturing in ways that might reveal too much. Like whether a life spent building walls is actually a life at all. Tegan studied him with the same intensity she brought to everything, reading between words for truth or manipulation, trying to determine if this was genuine or elaborate game with rules she didn't understand. And you think letting a desperate woman and her children live here solves those questions? I think your children remind me that courage isn't about power. It's about being small and scared, and doing what needs doing anyway. Dashwood heard the honesty in his own voice, and couldn't decide if it felt like weakness or strength. I think you remind me that dignity doesn't come from what you own, but from how you carry yourself when you have nothing. Pretty words. But Tegan's voice had softened slightly, skepticism giving way to cautious consideration. What happens when the novelty wears off? When Merrick's questions get annoying and Seraphine's nightmares disrupt your sleep, and I'm just another responsibility you didn't ask for? Then we figure it out together instead of me figuring it out alone. The answer came easier than expected, as if some part of him had been preparing for this conversation without conscious awareness. Stay, not as guests or charity cases or people working off debt. Stay as family. The word hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them had the courage to fully examine. Family meant permanence, meant claims and obligations that went beyond transaction or convenience, meant vulnerability that could destroy if mishandled. Family. Tegan repeated it slowly, testing the shape of it in her mouth. You want to play house with strangers who knocked on your door in a storm? I want to stop living in a mausoleum where the only voices I hear are my own, or people paid to tolerate my presence. Dashwood met her eyes directly, letting her see whatever she needed to see to believe him. Your children brought life back into this house. You brought purpose beyond profit margins. Maybe that's worth more than everything else I've accumulated. 3 months passed with rhythm that transformed strangers into something closer to family, though none of them quite dared to name it that way. Merrick had claimed the bedroom with the window seat overlooking the lake, where he spent hours reading books that Mrs. Fletcher selected with understanding of what a 6-year-old needed, adventure and hope in equal measure. Seraphine's artwork covered the refrigerator and began appearing framed on walls that had stood bare for years. Dashwood found himself commissioning proper supplies, canvases and paints that cost more than her mother earned in months, watching as the girl's talent flourished with resources that had always been denied by necessity. Tegan had stopped insisting she was leaving soon, though she maintained careful boundaries that suggested permanence still felt dangerous. She ran the household with efficiency that freed Mrs. Fletcher for other tasks, organized Dashwood's business papers with precision that revealed sharp mind wasted on factory work, and slowly began to trust that tomorrow might arrive without disaster. But she still slept lightly, still checked on her children multiple times each night, still carried tension in her shoulders that spoke of waiting for the moment everything would collapse. Dashwood noticed because he'd become expert at reading the subtle signs of people preparing for violence they couldn't prevent. Winter had arrived properly now, snow covering the grounds in white that transformed the mansion into something from a fairy tale. Merrick built snowmen with zealous dedication, while Seraphine captured their yard in paintings that hung in the hallway outside her room. Dashwood found himself involved in snowball fights that undoubtedly damaged his reputation, if any of his associates could see. The fearsome boss ducking behind trees, while a 6-year-old pelted him with ammunition packed by small hands. Mrs. Fletcher documented these moments with her phone, creating records of joy that had never existed in this house before. His business associates had noticed the changes, commenting with varying degrees of subtlety about how he'd become softer in recent months, less willing to pursue aggressive expansion or eliminate competition with the ruthlessness that had built his empire. He'd deflected their concerns with vague explanations about strategic repositioning, about playing longer games that required patience they couldn't yet understand or appreciate fully. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than any business strategy. He'd learned that empires built on fear eventually collapsed under their own weight, that money accumulated without purpose became burden rather than achievement, That power, wielded without connection to humanity, created isolation that no amount of success could fill. Merrick had taught him that in a single night of standing in rain asking for help. The irony wasn't lost on him that a 6-year-old had succeeded, where decades of therapy and self-reflection had failed. Sometimes wisdom came from the most unexpected sources, delivered by messengers too young to know they were changing lives, simply by being desperate enough to knock on doors that should have remained closed to them and their problems. Christmas was approaching fast, and Dashwood had found himself in the unusual position of shopping for gifts that weren't transactional. Not watches for business partners or jewelry for associates' wives meant to maintain relationships that served purposes beyond friendship. These purchases were motivated by desire to see joy on specific faces, to create memories that would last beyond the moment of unwrapping and discovery. One evening in early December, after the children had gone to bed, and the house had settled into quiet that felt comfortable rather than oppressive, Dashwood found Tegan in the library. She was curled in the leather chair near the fire with book in her lap, but her eyes stared into flames rather than at pages. "What are you thinking about?" He settled into the chair opposite hers, noting how she no longer flinched when he entered rooms unexpectedly. Tegan looked up with expression that held too many emotions to parse easily. "That I don't recognize my life anymore. 3 months ago, I was working double shifts at a factory and praying the landlord wouldn't evict us before I could scrape together rent. Now I'm reading classic literature in a mansion while my children sleep in beds that cost more than everything we owned combined." "Regret?" He asked it carefully, prepared for honesty that might hurt but needing to hear it anyway. "Terror," she answered immediately. "Not regret. Terror that I'll wake up, and this will have been fever dream, that we'll be back in that apartment with no heat and no medicine and no hope. Terror that I'm letting my children believe in stability, that can disappear the moment you change your mind." Dashwood leaned forward, elbows on knees, trying to find words that would carry weight of commitment without sounding like empty promise. "I'm not going to change my mind. This is your home now, legally, permanently, however we need to make it so you believe it. You can't know that." Tegan's voice cracked slightly. "You can't know that 6 months from now you won't be tired of children running through your halls, of my questions about your business, of the complications we bring just by existing in your world. I know that 3 months ago I was living in a tomb of my own making." He held her gaze steadily. "I know that your son brought me back to life by being brave enough to knock on my door. I know that your daughter reminded me what courage looks like when you have nothing except love to sustain you. I know that you showed me what dignity means when the world has stripped away everything else." Tears started falling down Tegan's face, silent tracks that caught firelight. "I'm so tired of being scared. I'm tired of waiting for disaster. I'm tired of teaching my children to never trust that good things can last, because experience says they never do." Dashwood moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hand with gentleness that felt foreign to fingers more accustomed to violence than comfort. "Then stop. Stay. Let this be real. Let your children paint the walls and track mud on the floors and believe that home is more than temporary shelter between crises." "What if I can't?" The whisper held decades of survival instinct that refused to believe safety could be permanent. "What if I don't know how to trust this? How to trust you? Then we learn together." He squeezed her hand carefully. "You teach me how to be family, and I'll teach you how to believe that walls can be more than temporary protection. They can be foundation for something that lasts." Tegan looked at him with eyes that held hope and fear, in measures too close to distinguish. "You're asking me to risk everything. My children's hearts, my own sanity, our ability to survive if this falls apart. I'm asking you to risk believing that a little boy standing in rain asking for help wasn't random chance. It was the universe's way of saving us both from lives that looked successful but felt empty." Dashwood knew how it sounded, knew the vulnerability in admitting that wealth and power meant nothing without connection. "Stay, not as charity or convenience. Stay because this house became home the moment your children started laughing in it." Snow began falling outside the windows, soft flakes that drifted down with the same gentleness as that night when Merrick had appeared at the gates. Tegan watched it for a long moment before turning back to face him, with decision written across features that had learned to be strong because weakness meant destruction. "One condition." Her voice gained strength, even as tears continued falling. "We're partners in this. Not you rescuing me, not me being grateful. Equal partners figuring out how to build family from broken pieces. Partners." Dashwood agreed immediately, feeling rightness in the word that had nothing to do with business arrangements or temporary alliances. Equal and permanent, and figuring it out together. Tegan nodded slowly. then smiled. Small and tentative, but real, in a way that transformed her entire face. Merrick is going to be insufferable when he realizes his plan worked. He told me 2 weeks ago that you needed us as much as we needed you, and I told him he was being ridiculous. He's 6, and he's wiser than most people I know. Dashwood found himself smiling back, feeling muscles move in patterns that had been dormant for years. We should probably listen to him more often. Absolutely not. But Tegan's laugh was warm, carrying relief and hope, and the first stirrings of trust that maybe, possibly, good things could last if you were brave enough to believe in them. He already thinks he knows everything. We can't encourage him. They sat in comfortable silence, broken only by fire crackling and snow tapping against windows. Two people who'd found each other through desperation and stayed through choice. Upstairs, children slept peacefully for the first time in their young lives, dreaming dreams that didn't feature fear or loss or endings that came too soon. The mansion that had been mausoleum had become home through the simple act of opening doors to strangers who knocked. Dashwood understood now what he'd been building toward without knowing. Not empire of power and wealth, but foundation strong enough to support the weight of family and love and belonging that transcended blood and circumstance. Morning would bring new challenges and complications that came with blending lives that started in different worlds. But tonight, there was snow falling gently, fire burning steady, and the knowledge that courage sometimes looked like a boy standing in rain asking for help, and sometimes looked like a woman choosing to trust, despite every reason not to. Thank you all for following this story from that cold night when Merrick knocked on the gates to this warm evening, where a family was born from rain and circumstance. If you've enjoyed this journey, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything, and helps me continue bringing stories like this to you.